Hi, this is Cheryl Paulhus. Welcome back to Attachment and Trauma. This is Module 3. Today we're going to be talking about epigenetics, neuroscience, and the fourth phase of attachment theory. Course objectives are to distinguish between the prototype and revisionist perspective of attachment research, define epigenetics, neuroscience, and the fourth phase, describe the interplay of genes and environment. We'll be talking about how the brain is directly shaped by interpersonal experiences and gain a deeper understanding of genes and environment. We'll talk about the neuroscience of trauma and its relationship to the brain, and the role of attachment in the area of self-regulation. A central tenet of attachment theory is that a person's attachment pattern in adulthood is a reflection of his or her attachment history, beginning with the person's earliest attachment relationships. However, the precise way in which early representations might shape adult attachment patterns is a little bit ambiguous, and different perspectives on this issue have evolved in the literature. According to the prototype perspective, representations of early experiences are retained over time and continue to play an influential role in attachment behavior throughout the life course. In contrast, the revisionist perspective holds that early representations are subject to modification on the basis of new experiences, and therefore may or may not reflect patterns of attachment later in life. So one of the major themes of attachment theory is that the way we think, feel, and behave in our adult relationships is a reflection of our attachment history. So it's important to be aware of the evaluation of research and literature. So let's look at this just a little bit more closely. The revisionist perspective holds that early attachment representations are revised and updated in light of ongoing experience, and consequently may or may not correspond to attachment representations later in life. This view is based on the idea that working models of attachment, including those developed early in life, are subject to change as people enter relationships that are incompatible with their previous expectations. Kind of makes sense, right? The prototype perspective also assumes that working models are updated and changed as individuals encounter new events, but suggests that the representations developed in infancy remain unchanged and continue to shape interpersonal dynamics throughout the lifespan. So there is a slight difference in how this is being described, but it really is a big difference. So the prototype is essentially saying that it sticks with you for life. What happened earlier in life sticks with you. And even though new experiences can alter, which would make sense, help someone develop into more healthy attitudes, more healthy attachment styles, or the reverse, that those early patterns are there. They cannot really be erased. And the revisionist model, to my way of understanding, more or less says that there is a level of change that's a little bit more comprehensive. So let's see what the research says about this. So just some other ways of talking about this is that the perspective assumes that early representations are preserved over the course of development and reactivated in the context of new interactions. So again, we're talking about the prototype, which again, I just want to emphasize, because that it is an important differentiation, that that early attachment pattern does not disappear. It's there and it becomes reactivated. And the prototype perspective, one of Freud's most influential propositions was that a child's early relationship with his or her mother serves as a prototype. He used the word prototype for subsequent relationships throughout the lifespan. So he was also of the mind that it never really altered. Those early relationships really impacted everything that your life was built upon throughout the lifespan. Attachment patterns should be highly consistent across different developmental periods, because children are continuously drawing on patterns of behavior and belief acquired early in life. It has been assumed by many attachment researchers that attachment patterns should be highly consistent across these periods, as we just mentioned. The propensity of people to create or seek out environments that are consistent with their prototypes, thereby promoting stability, recreating your history. So there's the belief that people seek out what they know. And that's not a new notion. That's been around for a long time with the analysts. Recreating your history, you may have heard the term reenactment. So the critical theoretical difference between the revisionist and prototype perspectives lies in the fate they ascribe to representations developed early in life. The prototype perspective assumes that these early representations remain unchanged and can play a direct role in influencing relational experiences later in life. As such, the prototype can contribute a stable, sort of unchanging source of variance to attachment dynamics throughout the lifespan, allowing for the possibility that attachment patterns will be highly stable from infancy to adulthood. So here are some pictures that I thought were very interesting. The propensity to create or seek out environments that are consistent with their prototypes. Here you have a picture of a little girl earlier in life sleeping with her mother. Notice the posture, the body language, the way they're sleeping, how the mother is holding the child. And then fast forward about a year later, and here she is, the little girl, same little girl, sleeping. And notice the similarity between her and her mother. She is holding the baby, how she was held, sleeping in the same position. I thought that was quite fascinating. So even in the unconscious, even while sleeping, we're seeking out something similar. That's very powerful. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the research about these two different perspectives. A meta-analysis of the existing longitudinal data on attachment stability was conducted to test the relative veracity of the revisionist and prototype models of attachment stability. And the prototype model provided the best fit to the data, indicating that a prototype-like process may contribute to attachment stability across the life course. In summary, there is what the ultimate discussion of the results of this research, which you can find in this website that I've provided for you if you want to read it in its entirety. But ultimately, the kernel of it was that there is a moderate degree of stability in attachment from infancy to adulthood indeed, and that the pattern of stability observed is better accounted for by a prototype-like process than a revisionist one. Remember, the differences are that the prototype is saying that what gets laid down, those tracks that get laid down early on from birth to 3, really stick with you. And modifications can be made, things can be changed. We'll talk about things like earned security. You may have heard that when you're introduced to healthier attachment situations, healthier relationships, for example, if we're looking at movement towards health, that people can make changes. However, that nothing really erases those early patterns, and the revisionist has a different slant on that, but fundamentally quite different. So let's look at, we briefly touched upon this study in the last module, but I want to get into it a little bit more in depth. Let's look at, it's one of the most substantial longitudinal studies ever performed, and let's see what it reveals. This study has been going on for 30 years now. It was initiated in 1974, and Sroufe and his colleagues recruited 267 low-income expectant mothers from a high-stress poverty sample to be subjects of a longitudinal study that's now spanned 3 decades. And the investigators found that children classified as secure in their early years were more likely to rebound from adverse circumstances than children who had been found to be anxiously attached or insecure as infants. So this would sort of fit in with what we were just talking about with the prototype model, that those early tracks are going to impact you throughout your development. So if you were considered and classified as a secure infant, secure toddler, secure child, that despite stressors experienced later in life, that the rebound, that the resiliency was there, that it definitely had a positive impact on having to face those challenges, whereas children who had been insecure and then were facing challenges, that their history also really impacted their ability to face those challenges, probably not in as an efficient way or effective way. So let's see what the study holds for us. This is called the Minnesota Longitudinal Study of Risk and Adaptation, and it really has been the source of a vast literature about the predictive power of early attachment relationships, while distinguishing the impact of these relationships from the effects of social class or temperament. And over the 3 decades, the investigators found that, again, that their results were indicating the prototype model, and that over the past 35 years, in study after study, that attachment security with a primary caregiver measured in infancy predicted important aspects of adjustment in functioning throughout childhood and into adulthood. So they've been following these children from birth now into their 30s. And the researchers found in follow-up studies that secure infants possessed enhanced resiliency, such as a sense of mastery or the confidence that they could influence the world around them. So think about those internal working models, the cognitions and the behaviors, the feelings, how one feels about the self and themselves in relation to others, that what this is essentially saying, that the secure children had a greater sense of mastery, that they felt more trusting, more confident, that they could control their fate, the outcomes of their efforts. And let's see, what else the study has revealed. Many findings in this study, and used in hundreds of journals as a reference. So the study also revealed that the anxiously attached children tended to suffer from underlying problems with self-esteem. And the researchers found in follow-up studies that secure infants did possess these enhanced resiliency traits, as we mentioned, the sense of mastery, the confidence that they could influence the world around them. And this sense of mastery was something that Bowlby had predicted and made about infants that had caregivers who were sensitive, who were attuned and responsive to their needs. Remember, what does it take to make a secure infant sufficiently responsive, attuned, and sensitive to the infant? Much like Harry Stack Sullivan's Good Enough Mother. So in the Minnesota study, ineffective dependency versus effective dependency was examined in preschool, middle childhood, and adolescence as they followed these children. So Sroufe was looking at these three classes of anxiously avoidant children, which are termed, these are insecure, anxiously avoidant, later to become dismissive adults. So they have slightly different terminology as they go into adolescent and adult categories. Disorganized, fearful adult, anxiously ambivalent, also referred to as resistant, preoccupied adult. So if we can think back just for a few minutes about how each of these children presented their strategies. So the avoidant, the dismissive child was one that was insecure, however, had a strategy that more or less would shut people out, turn their backs, not look for comfort because they had been more or less consistently been programmed that they weren't going to get the response, they weren't going to get the support, so they learned to try to deal with things on their own, and they were just as insecure and anxious as the child who is termed anxiously ambivalent or resistant. Remember, that's the child that has the mother that's a little bit more inconsistent. Sometimes she's there, sometimes she isn't. So the child becomes very clingy, dependent, tearful, not quite sure. Sometimes they get what they need, sometimes they don't. And so their strategy is a little bit more overt, crying, clinging, and very similar internally to the avoidant child, but just a very different behavioral presentation. And then the disorganized child is the one that really is running into these situations where there's no solution. The mother or the primary caregivers are the source of fear, who are supposed to be the source of comfort, and it's really kind of a terrifying situation, and the children end up with no real strategy to deal with their distress. And most often you see these patterns in caregivers who are abusive or terrified themselves, not necessarily abusive, but maybe had been raised by an abusive parent themselves, and are really very afraid of their infants and may rely on their infants for a lot of support. not sure what to do, afraid. And so this can also be resulting in a disorganized attachment. So these three styles of anxiously avoidant or insecure children continue to manifest this ineffective dependency well into adolescence. And the group characterized with a dismissing or also a fearful strategy was more likely to evoke controlling and angry responses in their preschool teachers. So what would this look like if you were in a classroom and you were watching children with these different attachment strategies with their teachers? So the avoidant child would be withdrawn, quiet, quietly anxious. And the insecure, the anxious child who was ambivalent would not be focused, would be asking a lot of questions, would be outwardly very dependent and clingy. And then the secure child would be content, engaged, on task. And the disorganized child that you would see would be angry, depressed, not following directions, short fuse, difficulty making friends. So you can see how this might play out in the classroom, for example, how the teacher may respond to these children and the kinds of difficulties that it's going to continue to reenact with their behaviors, the kinds of responses they're going to get from people based on their behavior, based on their internal states, how they're trying to cope with their environments and with the people in their environments. So they had a group of folks, teachers with no knowledge of the child's history, also watching other teachers. And they noted that the teachers were treating children in the different categories of attachment differently. Okay, no surprise. Those that were observing noticed that the teachers tended to respond to secure children, children that had secure histories. They treated those children in a warm, respectful manner. Now, this is what the secure children expect. They trust that people are going to treat them well. They feel competent. They feel in control of their situation. They feel confident that they can make things happen. And they were treated in a similar fashion. The preoccupied, ambivalent, resistant group, the teachers were warm to them. Remember, these are the clingy, crying, but they tended to be highly controlling, doing things for them that really didn't need to be done for them and treating them as if they were much younger than they were. And then the dismissing children, and as well as the fearful children, the teachers tend to had low expectations with the avoidant group, displayed little nurturing and got angry at them more frequently. So whatever the dismissing strategy, turning their back, not listening, sort of ignoring the teacher or those who were acting out, the teacher tended to get more angry with and get frustrated. I wouldn't say lose their temper, but got frustrated with these children. That would then strengthen the response of the internal working model, which is people aren't there for me, people don't really care about me, people are not going to be there for me. This is starting at a very early age. And again, something I want you to think about is that the children, all with different presentations, were equally needy and anxious, but just were presenting themselves differently, but all suffering with their insecurities. So these behavioral presentations that we're talking about and the distinctions are important to recognize as having diverse internal meanings. So both groups, all groups are equally needy, secure and insecure, and the different types of insecure presentations, but they present very differently. Despite being equally needy, they present very differently. And this is very important for clinicians and teachers and parents to understand. So if these distinctions are detected with some degree of reliability, it could lead to increased effective interventions for at-risk youth, as well as just youth in general. So these distinctions will be discussed more fully in the next session. Children with histories of secure attachment are less vulnerable to stress and better able to take advantage of opportunities for growth. Let's just talk a little bit more about these children's history before we go on. The coders were blind to the children's history, and they watched the videotapes of the interaction between teachers and each child. And so the ratings came through, as we just spoke of, and just a little bit more about the secure, besides teaching and responding to them in a warm, respectful manner, they set age-appropriate standards for them. They had higher expectations for them. And also had them taking care of tasks and doing things sometimes that were a little bit more advanced. So that's also very interesting. All right, so moving on, one of the great questions investigated by human development researchers is the issue of resilience. So what determines a child's ability to deal with the inevitable stressors and setbacks of life? It's been shown repeatedly that children with histories of secure attachment are less vulnerable to stress and better able to take advantage of opportunities for growth. And moreover, when these same children go through a troubled period, their prior experiences of feeling nurtured aren't erased. So it still influences their response to the new situation. So you can see in this slide here, kind of the trajectory: a child's mind, empathy, resilience, and strong attachment going together, and the trajectory of vulnerability and resilience. So those with the secure attachment really following, even experiencing stress throughout life, a degree of resilience that really buffers them and ushers them into good adaptations and mental health. And also, contrary to that, the insecure attachment, that is a child that's more vulnerable to stress and perhaps also more vulnerable to those trajectories like personality disorders, which we know create tremendous suffering in relationships and traumatic reactions. According to Alan Shore, the significance of Bowlby's constructs resulted in the development of an interdisciplinary perspective in understanding the human being. Bowlby purported that collaborative knowledge from an array of sciences would yield a powerful model in studying developmental phenomena. So this is a picture that illustrates how all the concepts we've been talking about, internal working model, how the right brain, the child, and the adult, the primary caregivers, are really synchronizing their brains, influencing each other. The child is really being imprinted with the parents' models of regulation, the psychoneurobiological regulator, which we'll talk about more um, about how that happens. Because we now know that psychological patterns are also patterns of neural organization, and because the brain as well as the mind develop in the crucible of attachment relationships, a familiarity with the basics of contemporary neuroscience will enrich your understanding of the multiple dimensions of the self. So, early life experiences exert a profound and long-lasting influence on physical and mental health throughout life. And this collaborative knowledge of the neuroscience and attachment theory led to an explosion in attachment research from a spectrum of disciplines, including developmental biology, neurochemistry, again, developmental psychology, and psychoanalysis, all sharing a common principle that the beginnings of living systems indelibly set the stage for every aspect of an organism's internal and external functioning throughout the lifespan. Again, selecting these slides so you can see what Alan Shore is illustrating through his concepts of how powerful the relationship is in setting up the neural networks of how the brain operates and functions, and in laying down the patterns for a lifetime. How incredibly profound these early relationships are. Because we now know that psychological patterns are also patterns of neural organization, and because the brain as well as the mind develop in the crucible of attachment relationships, this is a very important concept. We're going to continue to learn about contemporary neuroscience. So the expression of genes is influenced by experiences and the environment to produce individual differences in behavior, cognition, personality, and mental health. So these early life experiences are very profound, and the efforts to identify the primary causes of this have significantly benefited from studies of epigenetics. And Conrad Waddington introduced the term epigenetics in the early 40s, and he defined epigenetics as the branch of biology which studied the causal interactions between genes and their products, which brings the phenotype into being. And here, thought this was an amazing picture. The field of epigenetics is quickly growing, and with it, the understanding that both the environment and individual lifestyle can also directly interact with the genome to influence epigenetic change. These changes may be reflected at various stages throughout a person's life and even in later generations. So this is a study of how genes and environment interact to influence what's called epigenetic changes. And the dynamic relationships between genes and social experience have direct effects on brain development and behavior. Alan Shore has talked about how the last 3 decades, developmental neuroscience has clearly shown that the relationships between genes and social experience have direct effects on the brain and the development of the brain and behavior. So where first we had a theory, now we have solid evidence for the enduring impact of the environment on the genome. And that's called epigenetics. Another way to say this is that the brain needs more than genes to grow. It needs social experience. It needs social experience. So this new understanding of epigenetics is driving research and clinical practice, and it's of great importance for healthcare providers. The brain doubles in size during the first year, and this means that the first year is a very critical period when disruptions of developmental processes can have lifelong effects. There's even much discussion now about in utero, in the fetus, and the mother experiencing stress and type of impact that this has on the fetus. Alan Shore does some amazing lectures on this around when a mother is under stress, what happens in particularly the last trimester. So this is a period of vulnerability for the developing infant, the first year, and it's a period when therapeutic interventions will have very strong effects. So interventions, early childhood interventions, therapeutic interventions with parents who are very depressed, have mental health issues, are very stressed, or just do not have a lot of knowledge about what we're talking about today. Early attachment issues, how important it is, the various impacts that different styles have, what children need. Many folks don't just know this naturally, and a lot of great work can be done in early interventions. So what Alan Shore might say that there is maximal plasticity in the brain during particularly the first year, but the first 3 years. And understanding the mechanisms involved in the initiation, maintenance, and heritability of epigenetic states is an important aspect of research in current biology, particularly in the study of learning and memory, emotion, and social behavior in humans. So let's talk more about genes and environment and see if we can really get a good understanding of epigenetics. Epigenetics involves the study of how the environment shapes our genes. And it is the study of the biological mechanisms that will switch genes on and off. What does that mean? So I love this quote by Carlin Lyons Ruth. She says, "Your apple tree may have the genes to produce wonderful apples, but those genes will never be expressed if there's no sun to ripen the fruit." And here we're talking about all that we've been discussing up till now, those early attachment experiences. That is the sunshine that will ripen the fruit. And some genes will only be expressed if the conditions are beneficial, and other genes may only be expressed if the conditions are pathological. So what does that mean? Epigenetics controls genes. There are certain circumstances in life that can cause genes to be silenced or expressed over time. In other words, they can be turned off and become dormant, or turned on and become active. So a human being has trillions of cells specialized for different functions in muscles, bones, and the brain. And the differences among cells are determined by how and when different sets of genes are turned on or off in various kinds of cells. So the human genome, first of all, the genome, let's say what a genome is an organism's complete set of genetic instructions. And it contains all of the information needed to build that organism and allow it to grow and develop. And the human genome, or set of instructions that we all have, contains 2 copies of every gene, 1 copy inherited from the mother and 1 from the father. For a small number of genes, only the copy from the mother gets switched on, and for others, only the copy from the father is turned on. And this pattern is called imprinting. So cells are fundamental working units of every human being, and all the instructions required to direct their activities are contained within the chemical known as DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, simply DNA. DNA from humans is made up of approximately 3 billion nucleotide bases. And there are 4 fundamental types of bases that comprise DNA. And for short, we'll just say A, C, G, and T. So get it? There are cells that are fundamental working units, all made up of DNA. And DNA is made of 4 types of bases, A, C, G, and T. So the sequence, or the order of the bases, is what determines our life instructions. Our DNA sequence is mostly similar to that of a chimpanzee. Only a fraction of distinctively different sequences makes us human. So within the 3 billion bases, there are about 20,000 genes. And genes are specific sequences of bases that provide instructions on how to make important proteins. Complex molecules that trigger various biological actions to carry out life functions. So epigenetics is the study of biological mechanisms that will switch the genes on and off. What does that mean? Epigenetics involves the study of how the environment shapes our genes. And we're interested in this, very interested, because behavioral epigenetics shows that our behavior could have long-term effects on the regulation of the genome function. Certain circumstances in life can cause genes to be silenced or expressed over time. In other words, they can be turned off or turned on. And some of these concepts I'm repeating because they can be a little bit foreign, and sometimes the more you hear them, they begin to make more sense. The research has revealed that epigenetic mechanisms are related to psychopathology, for example, in the case of schizophrenia. And research has identified epigenetic mechanisms mediating between environmental and psychological factors that contribute to normal and abnormal behavioral development. And this is very relevant to consider epigenetic factors such as life adversities, trauma, disorganized attachment, as related to its clinical manifestations than just genetic factors. So what we're saying is that some of these very unfortunate environmental and relational experiences can turn on genes that cause great suffering in folks, and also likewise, a lot of enriched environments may help suppress genes that could otherwise be very problematic. So the field of epigenetics is quickly growing, and with it, the understanding that both the environment and individual lifestyle can directly interact with the genome to influence epigenetic change. And these changes may be reflected at various stages throughout a person's life and even in later generations. There are a number of studies that have suggested that environmental stressors in a parent may harm the health of subsequent generations. This was a very interesting study of the underweight babies that were born to malnourished Dutch women during World War II, who grew up to give birth to underweight children decades after the war and food rationing had ended. So human epidemiological studies have provided evidence that prenatal and early postnatal environmental factors influence the adult risk of developing various chronic diseases and behavioral disorders. And studies have shown that children born during the period of the Dutch famine from 1944 to 45 have increased rates of coronary heart disease and obesity after maternal exposure to famine during early pregnancy compared to those not exposed to famine. Likewise, adults that were prenatally exposed to famine conditions have also been reported to have significantly higher incidence of schizophrenia. So, what does this mean? The scientific evidence from this particular period of time that's been studied suggests that this environmentally triggered a gene expression or what's called an epigenetic imprint that might have repercussions far beyond the immediate host body. So in plain language, what happened to grandparents had some impact on generations later. Something got turned on that stayed turned on. This was let's talk a little bit more, because it is really fascinating research that's been done on the Dutch famine. It was known as the Hunger Winter in Dutch, and it was a famine that took place in the German-occupied part of the Netherlands, especially in the densely populated western provinces north of the Great Rivers during that winter of 44-45, near the end of World War II. And a German blockade had cut off food and fuel shipments from farm areas. And some 4 to 5 million people were affected, and they survived because of soup kitchens, but as many as 22,000 died because of the famine. So this had very important repercussions. There were, of course, many women who were pregnant during the famine, and they had children and grandchildren down the generations who were unusually small and were prone to diabetes and obesity. And this was after the famine had been well over. It still impacted generations. So there's been some other studies as well looking at this phenomena, animal studies that have also found that stress to a parent, such as exposing a pregnant mouse to toxic chemicals or mildly shocking a mouse to make it be fearful, can result in effects such as infertility or changes in behavior that persist for several generations that can't be explained simply just by genetic mutations. So what they're saying is that the stress of those experiences turned genes on or off, causing these mutations that lasted generations. So of course, the mental health, the behavioral health field, attachment theory, and all the interdisciplinary studies and researchers are very interested in this. Here you show a slide so on the right-hand side of the screen is the granddaughter, and on the other side, the grandmother. And what is it demonstrating? That these epigenetic changes can affect people over the generations, that stressful life events like a famine, like trauma, like relational violence, disorganized attachment, can create genetic vulnerabilities. And then, of course, there are things with this knowledge that we can do a lot in prevention and in intervention, providing positive bonding experiences, intervening with children and youth, intervening with the parent, with the caregiving system. Important stuff. So there was a breakthrough discovery in behavioral epigenetics, and it was reported some years ago in the prestigious journal Nature Neuroscience. And the leading research group headed by Dr. Meany studied the effects of mother rats and maternal care on offspring behavior and the impact it had on brain development, in other words, early attachment behaviors. And they found that after birth, rat mothers who frequently licked were very nurturing to their offspring, that this kind of nurturing or maternal behavior had a deep impact on their pups' brain development, and as well as the neuroendocrine stress response. And it was a good response, so we'll get into a little bit more detail about that, but it's fair to say that the good mothering, the nurturing mothering, the pups were more stress resistant and more relaxed and had better brain development. So Meany's research initially focused on the relationship between this early maternal care and stress response in the rat pups. And the experiments here kind of go through exactly what happened during the experiments. So what Meany did was he took rat pups outside of their maternal environment and let them be handled by humans, which would cause, when they put the babies back in with the rat mothers, the mothers would lick the pups a lot more to get the human scent off, because that's a survival thing. They don't want them to have these foreign smells on them that will bring attention to them. And the licking, the grooming, the nurturing had a very good impact on the stress response. They likewise took pups out that did, they separated them and they didn't handle them at all. And there was no handling, and they put them back in with the mothers, so they got no extra nurturing. That was the second group. So what they found was the pups that got highly nurtured grew up to be calm adults, while the rat pups who received little nurturing kind of grew up to be little nervous Nellies, little nervous rats. So it turns out that the difference between the calm and the anxious rat is not genetic, it's epigenetic. So what they meant by that is that the nurturing behavior of a mother rat during the first week of life shapes her pups' epigenomes. And the epigenetic pattern that mom establishes tends to stay put even after the pups become adults. So high nurturing mothers raise high nurturing offspring, and low nurturing mothers raise low nurturing offspring. So this may look like a genetic pattern, but it's not. Whether a pup grows up to be anxious or relaxed depends on the mother that raises it, not the mother that gives birth to it. Okay, so the step that we're talking about here is that they also placed pups. They took them away from the birth mother, so the low nurturing mother, take the pups from that mother and place it with its foster mother, who's a high nurturing mother, okay? And so that a pup is raised by its foster mother can become a high nurturing mother. Certain things get switched on by the nurturing. They also found that was interesting in this experiment that there were certain drugs that they provided that could undo the damage of the lack of nurturing. So there was another result to the experiment that suggested that they were able to remediate the situation of the behavioral deterioration that had been taking place by not being nurtured. So basically what they were proving is that genes can be turned on and off throughout life, and that's why through the support, that's what the cross-fostering was doing, was showing that supported environments, influences like good teachers, good caregivers, good therapists are so important that you can take a child or a rat pup that's with a environment that's not so healthy and is not going to have good results, and put them in a very enriched environment, and it changes. It makes a difference in the child's epigenetic development. So when we're talking epigenetics, we're very much talking about people's ability to move beyond just what they've inherited through their DNA. It's about what we acquire during our own lifetime, and also the changes that we can potentially make in our own lives and other people's lives that we don't have to pass on to our children, and that we can make changes epigenetically. So you may have heard, oh, well, my parents had this particular disorder or stress, and I'm just prone. It's not true. It's not a fatalistic view anymore based on some of these breakthrough discoveries and experiments that are being done, that we're able to change the physical experience. So we're going to talk a little bit about remembering trauma in the limbic system. The body keeps the score. So physical experience is at the very core of who we are and how we experience the world, ourselves, and the interpersonal is at a deep sensory level. The most elementary imprints that are deep in your soul and have profound meaning are created through your experiences with others and the formation of the brain, particularly the early developing structures in the limbic system, the amygdala, the cerebellum, takes in sensory experience, and certain sensations come to mean something. Because the physical experience is at the very core of who we are, is why insight in talking alone doesn't really change some of these profound meanings. And this gives us great direction through the discovery of neuroscience in regard to treatment and body-focused treatment that we mentioned back in Module 1 in concert with traditional therapies. So if you can see here, these are the deep structures of the brain, the limbic system, which sounds the alarm if we fear that there's danger. The brainstem is that part of, sometimes they refer to as the reptilian brain, reacts instinctively. It controls the breathing. And the frontal lobes are that thinking part that develops later, not fully developed now, we know, until into the 20s, and that we can make new connections throughout our entire life. But they are, the frontal lobes, often referred to as the chief executive officer, tends to shut down when things are really overwhelmed, which means, what do? You respond on a feeling and behavioral, a body level. The body keeps the score. So what best characterizes the advances of the last 10 years is the tremendous acceleration of interdisciplinary research. And this has allowed for the integration of data from a spectrum of different fields of study, each of which is attempting to more deeply understand the human condition. And the human brain is a social organ that is shaped by experience, and that is shaped in order to respond to the experience that you're having. So particularly early in life, if you're in a constant state of terror, your brain is shaped to be on alert for danger and to try to make those terrible feelings go away. So the brain can get very confused, and that can lead to problems with excessive anger, excessive shutting down, and doing things like taking drugs to normalize your feelings, to make oneself feel better. And these things are almost always the result of having a brain that's set to fear and danger. So the study of attachment theory in combination with trauma has been the most prolifically researched areas of the 21st century in helping to develop a deeper understanding of the relationship among the emotional, cognitive, social, and biological forces that shape human development. Now, a few more things about genetics and epigenetics. So the conventional view of genetics is steeped in fatalism. We inherit a unique genetic code from our parents, and for better or worse, this DNA is unalterable. That's what we once thought. And some diseases run through families like prairie fires, inevitable and unstoppable. What we once thought, things like high blood pressure, dementia, mental illness. We now know that epigenetics is revolutionizing our understanding of genetics and heredity, and showing how nurture combines with nature to give rise to the infinite variety of life. So we really want to, with all this information about neuroscience, epigenetics, attachment theory combined together, and getting this deeper understanding that it is breaking the bonds of genetic destiny through helping cultivate secure bonds of attachment early in life, and either those also making reparations throughout life. We know now there's tremendous research that shows how we can repair much of this. So understanding how early life experiences can give rise to lasting epigenetic memories confers the increased risk for mental disorders is emerging at the epicenter of modern psychiatry. So essentially what that means is that all this information, this research, is incredibly important in determining interventions, in the way that we conceptualize and think about treatment, development, attachment styles, promoting different types of treatment, how we educate folks in our practices. So we have learned, as attachment theory has expanded into studies that include neuroscience, that most experience is automatically processed on a subcortical level in the brain, and that unconscious interpretations can take place outside of awareness that is on a nonverbal level, implicit memory. And implicit memory is sometimes referred to as unconscious memory or automatic memory. And implicit memory uses past experiences to remember things without thinking about them. The performance of implicit memory is enabled by previous experiences, no matter how long ago those experiences occurred. A subset of implicit memory, procedural memory, enables us to perform many everyday physical activities such as walking, riding a bike, without having to give thought to it. And a large majority of implicit memories are procedural in nature. So the neurobiology of attachment, let's talk about this a little bit. The study of the developmental processes that mediate the infant's first attachment to another human being, and how the psychobiological mechanisms of these processes indelibly influence the development of the infant at later points in life. This is something that Bowlby began setting up in his theory for other people to be able to research and investigate. And this is how, when we talk about treatment, talking through insight and understanding sometimes has a limited influence on treatment because of these very early phases. And many of the new developments in treatment pay particular attention to the brain and body-based therapies in conjunction with traditional therapies, which are also very important. The brain is formed by feedback from the environment, and it's a profoundly relational part of our body. And in a healthy developmental environment, your brain gets to feel a sense of pleasure, engagement, in exploration, and your brain opens up to learn, to see things, to accumulate information, to form friendships, etc. So this growing body of studies really demonstrate that the infant's early maturing right hemisphere is impacted by these early social experiences, laying the track for all these things later in life. And it has profound implications for the ability of individuals to regulate emotions, which is critical to emotional health. Behavior, biological, and social functions are associated. And separation stress is a loss of maternal regulators of the infant's immature behavioral and physiological systems that results in, remember those stages of separation, protest, despair, and detachment, so we can imagine what might be going on in the neurobiology of the brain when these things go wrong. Attachment research has made significant progress in illuminating how individual attachment organization contributes to various patterns of regulating emotions, cognitive processing, and personality development. And attachment theory can legitimately claim to shine a light on people's states of mind with regard to close relationships and how these relationships are experienced and handled under stressful conditions. So in closing, some points to remember: that some genes will only be expressed if the conditions are beneficial, and other genes may only be expressed if the conditions are pathological. In typical parent-infant interactions, the dyad is misattuned 1/3 of the time. That's not a big deal. Repair is the big deal. Repair of misattunement is key, not perfect parenting. So people often make mistakes. As we know, no one is perfect. What's really important is that people repair things when things fall apart. And there are inevitable misattunements, and they're valuable stress tolerance practice time for the infant. So things go wrong, you teach your children, hey, we're going to get back on track. This is how we do it. Take a deep breath. So these kinds of things that are just normal parts of life and learning. When we're talking about epigenetics, we're very much talking about people's ability to move beyond what they've inherited through DNA. This is another great discovery that things can change. We're not destined to the fate of our genes, and that the brain may participate in a big way in altering your state. So there's also been a lot of studies on mindfulness and correcting epigenetics that helps decrease likelihood of getting inflammatory diseases. We'll be talking about that more in the next session. And these have all been, incredibly important studies. The expression of genetic vulnerability contributing to many psychiatric disorders is under partial control. Vulnerability will not necessarily be expressed in a well-buffered environment. These are all very important points in thinking about interventions, treatment, and in hopefulness, instilling hopefulness. The infant has an open biobehavioral system at birth that takes its organization in part from the organization of the caregiving system. But there are other very important influences that can happen during life. And this research has implications for domestic and public policy for maternal support and its role in human disease prevention and economic health, much like Bowlby's did in the early 50s. Thank you very much, and we will see you next week in Module 4. Have a great week.